All right. Hello, everyone. So we ran out of time in class to talk about a few things that I think are incredibly helpful and things that will help you find and assess sources, which is what we've been talking about in English 102. So I want to give you a couple of tools that you might use. So if we go back to the exercise that we did in class where we were looking at the laminated articles, the transgressive hermeneutics of quantum physics, and atheist mayor suspends firemen, and NASA seeks help protecting Earth from aliens, right? So we can start to talk about what is true and what is not true. And I would say that what we're worried about with research is not necessarily information that's flat out wrong. We're not as worried about completely false information. We should be able to detect that relatively easily. What we are more worried about is the tendency towards bias and or intentional or unintentional misrepresentation or inaccuracy. So if we look at the article, How to Be a Human Lie Detector, what they discovered in research, so this is separate from the Stanford research that we looked at in class, researchers concluded that falsehood, lies, diffused or spread faster, farther, deeper, and more broadly than truth in all categories. Now, I have to make the joke here that anybody that's been to middle school knows this, right? That lies separate or spread more quickly than truth. And that's definitely still common, right? And sometimes that's like playing telephone, which if you're not familiar with the game of telephone, it's where you get a group of people, 9 or 10 people, and one person says something, they whisper it to the next person, that person whispers to the next person. And at the end, 9 or 10 people later, that last person says what they think they heard. And usually what happens is that truth, whatever was the original message, gets manipulated in some way, consciously or unconsciously along the way. Now, what they also found in that article is that it's not necessarily younger people who are more gullible or more likely to share inaccurate or false information. Older people are actually more likely, 7 times more likely, to share fake or misleading news stories. Now, I think that there's something to be said there, not necessarily that older people are necessarily more gullible or that younger people are more savvy. I think probably most of us would agree that younger people have a little bit more digital literacy. But I think contextually, older people, those over 65, also probably grew up in a time where you just simply trusted the news because it was the news. So a lot of that authority of the news source was sort of baked in. And now when we're trying to figure out what's a real source and what's a false source, with so many possibilities available, it's going to become a little bit difficult and people will fall back on what they're familiar with. So what they recommend in the article, How to Be a Human Lie Detector, is who's making the claim. What are their credentials? So this is what we talked about in class. Is my first step personally is always who wrote the thing. Are they trying to sell something? Are they trying to influence me in some way? Do they have an agenda? Everybody has an agenda. Everybody has a bias. And I would argue that every piece of writing is essentially a persuasive piece of writing. So it's not as though something is completely neutral. The next thing that they recommend is that we think about the premises of the claim, right? Premises are the things that we lay out, these things that are true, are claims. So what are those claims? What are my own initial assumptions? This is where we can fall prey to confirmation bias. Again, if I'm looking for information that agrees with me, that's confirmation bias. It's not to say that it's bad to look for information that supports your assumption, but we also have to make sure that we're looking at disconfirming or contrary data as well. Are there alternative explanations for the claim, right? And so we see this a lot of the time with what could be another possible explanation for something to happen. For example, if the claim is the earth is flat, and we believe that because it looks flat, might there be another explanation if the earth is a spheroid, an oblate spheroid, really? But it might be because it's so large that it looks flat to us, although it's not, right? Are there alternative explanations? What is the evidence of their claim, and how well do they fit with opposing explanations? One place that I would get worried about a source is if they don't present the full case, right? I think a good source is one that to some extent gives us all of the information and at least allows us to see what the two sides of the discussion are, and that we can make an educated guess or make our own decision based on the information that's presented. And then what further information do we need before we can make a judgment? And we talked about this in class. Do you need to search the author? Do you need to research the source? Do you need to look at the quotes and the original context of those quotes? And I think that these things often seem obvious when we really think about them. But I think what happens, and I've talked about this before, is that we live in a world where we don't do this, and we don't do it at a conscious level. If we do it at all, it's at an unconscious level, and it's limited. And usually the only times that we're really questioning things is if we disagree with them. But I think it's equally important to question things we do agree with for accuracy and things like that, because then, of course, we can fall into confirmation bias. Another way to test the truth or the reliability of something is to use what's called the CRAP test. And I didn't come up with this. A librarian at another institution came up with it. You could Google and find out the origin. And there are a couple different versions of this, but this is the simplest one, right? So the C is currency. How recent is the information? And we do want to be a little bit careful here as well. Just because information came out today does not necessarily mean that it's more accurate than information that came out yesterday. However, depending on the situation, depending on the topic, we might really take into account recency. An example of that would be artificial intelligence. An article that came out on artificial intelligence 10 years ago is not going to be as reliable as one that came out this year. If you Google COVID, you will find articles that were published 15, 20 years ago. It was a different variant of COVID, which also means it's slightly out of date. Reliability is the R. What kind of information is included? What sources, what evidence is being presented? Is it somebody making a claim? Hey, in my opinion, I think that. Or is there information that is something we could cross-check? 90% of X or Y. Those are the types of things that I'm looking for. Usually when I'm doing research is something that I can verify. And a lot of the time I'll look for something that is quantifiable, something that is a number. It is tricky, and any of y'all who have taken stats might be thinking about this. Statistics can be manipulated. Studies can be too small or could be poorly run. But again, this is like, is Harriet Tubman, was she a real person? What evidence do we have? And does the preponderance or the majority of the information point to yes or point to no? I'll go ahead and do the last two, I guess. A is authority. Who is the speaker and what is the source? This is something that we'll be looking at in the annotated bibliography, where we really look at who is that person. If they're a professor, what are they a professor of? Where do they teach? What other projects have they worked on? And what is the source, right? Where are they publishing things? What are the standards for a particular publication? In one of the classes, somebody mentioned reputation. When somebody is speaking, especially if they are a professional, whether that's a professor or a journalist, at some point, their reputation is on the line. And if they have a reputation of sharing inaccurate or false information, that's going to diminish or decrease their ability to do their job effectively in the long run. And then the P is purpose or point of view. Is the source biased? Is it trying to sell something? Now, part of this with the purpose or point of view is a little bit tricky because everyone is biased. We all have some level of bias that is inherent within us as human beings. The dictionary is biased. The encyclopedia is biased. We can talk about that further if you're interested why I say that. What we're not doing is just saying everything is biased. I can't trust anything. Or because bias is relative, I'm only going to trust certain things. What we're trying to do is figure out if the bias is one that would get in the way of truth or accuracy or authenticity. Where this happens is if we are trying to convince somebody, and in order to convince them, we are leaving out details or we're taking quotes out of context, that is going to be part of bias. I'll give you a couple of examples real quick. If I'm reading an article about early childhood education, and it is written by an early childhood education expert, I can safely assume that person is biased towards what is best for children, right? They have a vested interest in that. So again, we might think about that aspect, but let's say I found out that that person also is somebody who works for a radical think tank that believes children shouldn't be vaccinated or something like that. Now it changes things. And this is why we do the background research on the speaker. And I will say just quickly that we don't have to stalk them on social media. Usually a quick search, a quick evaluation is enough to look into that person and see, how biased are they. I was going to give you another example, and it's gone right out of my head. If I think of it, I'll bring it up. So as you research, a couple things to consider. Always pay attention to the URL. Again, a .edu, a .gov tend to be more reliable. I wouldn't just trust something because it's a .edu or .gov, but I'd say you're in pretty good hands in those cases. And it's also not to say that you should never trust something that's a .com or .org. We just want to make sure that we're doing those other checks as well. Read the About Us section. Who funds it? Who's on the board? Who started that project? That will tell us a lot about maybe potential bias and expertise. You can look at the quotes or lack of quotes. You can look at who is being quoted, and you can check quotes for context. And this actually goes to what I was going to say a minute ago on the previous slide. Let's say in class, before class started, and I was asking what people did over the weekend. And I said, over the weekend, I beat my children at Uno. Okay, Uno is a card game, if you're not familiar. And you left class and you said, my English professor just said over the weekend he beat his children. That is part of what I said. It would not be inaccurate to say you said that. However, it's misleading because what I actually said is at a game. So there's a vast difference between the two, right? And all of that's a lie too, because I never win at Uno when I play against my children. Use reverse image search. Everybody, I think, was familiar with that when we talked about it briefly in class. Cross-check the author who wrote that article. And then use something like Snopes or Media Bias Fact Check or All Sides. So Snopes is one stop. It's not always going to apply to what you are researching. The website is Snopes, SNOPES.com. And what they do is they will go out and they will check sort of things that are going around on the internet to see if they're true, if they're false. And so they do the fact checking. This was an example from 2018, I think, of an airplane that was supposedly abandoned in a forest with no signs of a crash around it, something like that. And what they discovered is, yes, this is a real plane. It is, however, sitting on a runway in California. And so it is not in the middle of a forest. Somebody has simply photoshopped in the forest. But this is an example of one of those pictures that was circulating on the internet, and people were trusting this image and believing it without verifying it. Another source that you can use is media bias fact check. And this is similar to All Sides, which I may have shown in class. So media bias fact check is a user-generated source. So this one, what I Googled was the Website Awareness Act. And what you can see here, if you read closely, is it says conspiracy level, tinfoil hat. So that's their high level of conspiracy theory. And pseudoscience level, which is people presenting information as science, which is not real science, is strong. And then down there at the bottom, it says factual reporting is low. This alone would be enough to really make me think twice before I ever cited it. But there are other ways to do this. You could simply Google the source. A lot of the times that will give you enough information, even if it's a Wikipedia entry. Allsides.com is another one. All Sides will tell you what the political leaning is. It will give you some information about the overall kind of leanings of things, right? So if I put in a source and I came on here and it was far left or far right leaning, I might be really cautious about how I use that source. And I might make sure that I'm double checking to make sure that information in a particular article is accurate. Okay. The best strategy is to cross-check your sources. Think of Carrot the goldfish that I showed you all in class. A quick double check. Is this accurate? Is this being reported anywhere else? Is going to save me a lot of trouble in the long run. Again, also thinking about context. Okay. So lastly, and I'm going to close this out because this video is getting longer than I anticipated. Reliable sources are sources that can be cross-checked against other information. Again, reverse image search, maybe the information appears in multiple other reliable sources. Number two, they're reputable sources with established credibility. All right, this goes back to when we talked about somebody's reputation is on the line. Forbes, National Geographic, BBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, they have high stakes for making sure that they're reporting accurately, because if they don't, that starts to diminish their reputation. Number three, does that source have authors that are known to be experts and or reliable journalists? I tend to say like one or the other is fine. If it's a source with an expert in a field, they're an expert economist, great. I have a higher level of trust. Is it a journalist who often reports in a particular field and has a long career? Great. I feel a lot better about quoting from that source. And then number four is, does it present information in such a way as to account for all sides? Again, making sure that that source is not cherry picking information or giving only partial picture of what's actually happening. Okay. So I know that's a lot of information, but I did want to sort of close the loop with some of the things that we're talking about in class on Thursday, and also fill in for some of the things that we won't get time to talk about on Tuesday because we won't have class. There you go. If you do have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, have a good one, and I will talk to you in the future.